And studies have actually shown that if you even only have one bad night of sleep, and maybe you just got 5 hours that night, that short amount of sleep deprivation already causes an acute inflammatory reaction in your body. So your body is already shifting its biology short term, in women even more than in men. Hey, and welcome to this week's episode of the Sleep Like a Boss podcast. My name's Annika Carroll. I'm a women's sleep and health coach, and I want to talk to you about the number one underlying reason why I think a lot of women struggle to sleep, and that is inflammation. And inflammation is something that is often not looked at by doctors or people who sleep specialists who do cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia only. And I think it is one of the main reasons why some of these tools do not work successfully in women or men alike, actually, because the underlying physical reason of inflammation hasn't been addressed and is a major contributor to insomnia. And studies have actually shown that if you even only have one bad night of sleep, and maybe you just got 5 hours that night, that short amount of sleep deprivation already causes an acute inflammatory reaction in your body. So your body is already shifting its biology short term, in women even more than in men. And while that is an acute reaction from your body, and if you get proper sleep the nights following, it can balance itself out. If you are somebody who doesn't get a good night's rest for longer periods of time, this definitely contributes to becoming chronically inflamed and making it then even more difficult for you to get a good night's sleep, because inflammation is a sleep saboteur in itself. And we're going to go into why that is. So we're going to talk about what is inflammation exactly, what are the main causes of inflammation, what are symptoms, and how is it linked to sleep, and what can we do about it. So inflammation is basically a natural response from the body to an invader, such as an infection or an injury. The classic example of an acute infection is a paper cut. So if you cut your finger with a piece of paper, it's going to get red, it starts swelling, it's going to get warm, there might be some pain involved, and that is an acute reaction from the body to heal with an inflammatory response, that paper cut. But there's other things, there's other inflammation that is called chronic inflammation. That is more of a long-term response of the body to things like pathogens, stress, environmental toxins, those kinds of things that really will set the body up for low-grade chronic inflammation and will have an impact on sleep and overall well-being. And while doctors do look for inflammation in the body, they generally use blood markers to do so. Blood tests, they assess inflammation levels in the body either by looking at CRP, so C-reactive protein, or ESR, erythrocyte sedimentation rate. Those are two markers that they can find in serum blood. And if those levels come back elevated, that is a sign of inflammation in the body. Those two markers, that's very important, they're what's called non-specific. So even though those levels came back elevated, you still don't know where the inflammation in the body is. So then the digging has to start to look at where is it, how can we assess it, and what's been causing it. And while I would assess blood work for my clients from a functional perspective, which is different from what the doctors are doing, what I do with my clients is I run a stool test, and that is the GI-MAP stool test. And that is basically a comprehensive test that analyzes inflammation, pathogens, so parasites, gut bacteria, bad and good gut bacteria, your digestive capacity. And there are also some additional markers on the GI-MAP that specifically guide us to the answer, is there inflammation in the system and do we need to address it? while we're linking it with symptoms that somebody might have. So on the test, we're looking for markers such as calprotectin, which is a marker that doctors would also use on a stool test to assess inflammation in the gut, zonulin, and then there's multiple other gut bacteria that are actually indicators of inflammation in the gut. How do I know if I have inflammation? There's really a lot of different symptoms that might show up. Digestive symptoms are the most obvious if we're talking about inflammation in the gut. So things like bloating, diarrhea, abdominal cramping and pain, but also things like brain fog, joint pain, stiffness, skin issues, anxiety. Those are often signs that there is something going on in the gut that needs addressing, that has caused inflammation. So, and how do we get this inflammation? So from my perspective, there's, I would say, 4 big contributors to chronic low-grade inflammation. Number 1 being what we eat. So inflammatory foods. Foods that are inflammatory are gluten, dairy, sugar, and alcohol. For sure, those are like the 4 big ones, plus foods that you have a potential sensitivity to. And I'm not talking a full-blown allergic reaction, but even just a sensitivity. So if you're eating pineapple and it causes like a tingling on your tongue, or you eat, think about something else, chickpeas and you get hives, rashes, or mucus developing or something like that, that can be a sign for a food sensitivity. And if that happens and you consume these things, the body doesn't really know how to deal with that, and that can also cause inflammation in the body. While gluten is always a bit of one where somebody's like, don't take out my gluten. Gluten is definitely inflammatory. There are studies that show that everybody who consumes gluten has gut damage after consuming gluten. People who are non-celiac disease or who are not gluten sensitive will also have that damage to their gut lining. And like a paper cut, that gets healed with an inflammatory reaction. However, their guts might heal faster than somebody who was sensitive to gluten. And for people who are sensitive to gluten or celiacs, we have to be really careful with that, because with them, gluten consumption could also lead to autoimmunity and thyroid issues. But gluten in general is one of the main big 4. So gluten, dairy, sugar, alcohol, like I said, that are definitely causing inflammation. And if you're trying to heal from inflammation, things that I would recommend that at least temporarily you take out of your diet. So what we eat is really one of the main contributors. Another one is really, really stress, because so the stress that we have like in everyday life, that could be everything that we're taking on that's too much that we're dealing with, that we don't have a break from. Then not sleeping is definitely a huge stress to the body. And all this stress, like I said, has been shown to cause acute inflammatory reactions, and has also been shown to actually alter your gut microbiome. So your good and bad gut bacteria, and it can shift the gut microbiome towards an overload of the bad bacteria, and they can be inflammatory. And through that, it can cause inflammation. This can, over time, the stress can also shut down your immune system. And because the immune system, actually, the majority of our immune system resides in our gut. And if we break down the gut lining and we with that harm the immune system, we just become way more vulnerable and open up the doors for the third reason that causes inflammation, pathogens. And pathogens can be things like I said, bad gut bacteria, fungi, it can be viruses, it can be parasites, and it can be infections. And one of the infections that I see with, I would say 90% of my ladies, is H. pylori, Helicobacter pylori, which is a bacteria that actually resides in your stomach and like drills itself into your stomach lining and lowers stomach acid. And with that takes your line of defense away. Your stomach acid would normally kill stuff that comes in, like you eat a parasite in like undercooked meat, or you eat an apple that wasn't fully washed and there's bacteria on there. If you have enough stomach acid, your body is able to kill that off, and it won't cause any harm in your gut. If you don't have enough stomach acid because you have an H. pylori infection, that defense is not there, and you're going to get a lot of pathogens in your gut that are not supposed to be there, that are causing inflammation. And if you then have symptoms like brain fog, skin issues, joint pain, whatever it is, anxiety, that's a sign that that inflammation actually hasn't stayed in the gut, but it has actually made its way through the system. So the food we eat, the inflammatory foods, the stress that we're under, and because of that, the pathogens that find their way into our system are definitely 3 big causes of chronic inflammation. Then comes number 4. That is then what we're going to get given to fight those pathogens often. And that could be anti-acid medications, proton pump inhibitors, because if we have an H. pylori infection, for instance, we might have symptoms like belching, and GERD, acid reflux, things where we think that's a sign of high stomach acid, but those are actually signs of low stomach acid because the H. pylori has lowered the stomach acid. And if we're then given proton pump inhibitors or taking Tums or things that lower our stomach acid even more, we're even more vulnerable, and we're just making these problems even bigger. And painkillers, like a lot of people take over-the-counter pain medication a lot. This is also something that has a really big effect on your gut microbiome and can cause inflammation very quickly. So is chronic inflammation, even if we're saying low-grade inflammation, is that a problem? Yes, because to what I just alluded to, because what happens in the gut doesn't necessarily stay in the gut. So that inflammation in the gut already has an impact on how are you digesting what you're eating. Can you actually absorb the nutrients from the food? How happy are you? How clear is your thinking? All these things. Risk of autoimmune disease increases. But it's really also affecting your sleep. And the one reason is, if we look at that connection between inflammation and sleep, it's going the one way. Like I said, you have that acute inflammation when you have that night of bad sleep. But if you have continuous nights of bad sleep, your gut microbiome changes. Your body then isn't able to make certain, they're called neurotransmitters, so chemical messengers in your body that would actually help you to calm down, like serotonin. Serotonin is made in the gut mostly, gets then transformed into melatonin, and it really helps us to calm down if we don't have the right neurotransmitters, because that environment in the gut just isn't right, either because we don't have enough nutrients, the right ones, or if we have inflammation, then that can really affect our ability to fall asleep. The other thing is, if we have this inflammation, the body is really smart, and the body has anti-inflammatory agents that it releases to hold that inflammation at bay and fight it. And one of those anti-inflammatory agents is cortisol. And it is released constantly to hold this inflammation at bay. And so if we're constantly low-grade, have that chronic low-grade inflammation, our body's constantly releasing cortisol day and night. And if it's higher at night because of that inflammation, melatonin just can't do its job. And we will have a hard time sleeping because, and then we have that hard time sleeping, and that lack of sleep deprivation also again causes inflammation, even if it's acute. But if an acute inflammation hits like a chronic inflammation, it's just a vicious cycle in the end that we kind of need to break. And oftentimes I find this is not addressed. Gut health is something that is not addressed by doctors or by sleep specialists who do cognitive behavioral therapy, because that's not their, oftentimes that's not what they're taught, because cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia teaches you tools, how to manage your day, how to manage your night, how to manage your anxiety around sleep, which are all great because they can be lowering cortisol, which is exactly what we want, right? So we can be able to fall asleep. But that if there is a physical underlying cause, you're kind of fighting against something that you don't know that you're fighting against. But cognitive behavioral therapy, for instance, or a solid bedtime routine alone will then not help, because you need support to take out everything that triggers the inflammation, look at what's going on in the gut, give the gut support to heal that, and then the cortisol levels overall will be lower because that inflammation has been lowered or taken away. And then your body has a lot easier time to fall asleep and to make the neurotransmitters that keep you calm and help you with sleep. That is also why something like in CBTI, it's often called sleep restriction or sleep compression is something that I personally am very, very resistant to do with women, and like really rarely do it. Because if we already have an inflamed body or somebody who's already burnt out, in my view, it is not the right approach to then restrict or compress sleep even more, because it stresses the body so much that we're just not getting on top of the inflammation, because that needs rest and like actually decompression instead of compression. And that is something that I personally have not found to be super helpful. And the challenge with the inflammation in the gut, and that is why I look at clients, not just at their gut health, but also at their liver, at their hormones, minerals and thyroid and everything, is because if you have this chronic gut inflammation and you have these endotoxins that are being released through this inflammation, the gut will really challenge the liver, because there's these toxins circulating in your body. When you have a leaky gut, everything goes in the bloodstream and then it's all over. And the liver's job is to clear that all out and make sure it doesn't constantly recirculate. And that over time really puts a burden on the liver. And this then is often what causes night wakings. This is what often in women leads to symptoms of estrogen dominance. That means sex hormones out of balance, and we have things like heavy and painful periods, PMS, bloating, headaches, fibroids, cysts, everything that's linked to estrogen dominance. Then estrogen is higher than progesterone. That alone can cause sleep issues in itself. This whole inflammation constantly raises cortisol, which is really stressful on the adrenals, will eventually slow down the thyroid. Because the body is already working so hard that the thyroid's like, I'm going to push the brake here. I cannot push this body any harder. And the interesting thing about thyroid is also that gut inflammation actually, like we said, raises cortisol to fight that inflammation. And this can lower T3, so thyroid hormone, and gut dysbiosis. So if we then have an imbalance of good and bad gut bacteria, which all goes in hand with the inflammation, actually impairs the conversion of T4 thyroid hormone to T3 thyroid hormone. That's why we often see thyroid issues with women who have sleep issues and who have gut issues, because it all basically goes together. And that's why we all need to look at everything at the same time. And how do we address chronic inflammation? So for me personally, the number one thing is sleep. Sleep is the perfect thing to address inflammation, because the body heals and recovers. And but it is kind of also the result of addressing the chronic inflammation. So if you're somebody who struggles with sleep and that is not your first option, but your goal to get to, number one for me is cut out anti-inflammatory foods. And this is temporary while you heal the gut. So removing processed foods, sugar, gluten, dairy, adding things and alcohol, adding things like fruits and vegetables, healthy fats, those things to your diet. Support number two, like support your nervous system. Really make sure you have breaks in your day. You have time for yourself so you can decompress. If you're struggling with anxiety, maybe get support. And this could be therapy. This could be something like tapping, whatever you prefer in those cases. Exercise, light exercise. Exercise has been shown to help with inflammation. And the other really important thing is, I think, test. Find somebody who tests what's going on in your system to make sure that you put the right steps in place on top of diet and nervous system support and movement to make sure you can get your system in balance and get away from that inflammation, to be able to sleep well and to be able to feel good and be healthy. And so if you're somebody who doesn't sleep and you have maybe some of these inflammatory symptoms that we talked about, being it's brain fog, stiffness, joint pain, skin issues, puffiness, gut issues, all those kinds of things, it might be a good time to start and get tested, because the longer you wait, the worse it gets and the longer it takes to heal. So because we really want to lower that cortisol, get the inflammation down, to lower the cortisol, to then be able to have melatonin do its job and help you sleep better. So I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions or comments, always reach out, and I'm looking forward to seeing you next time.